Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our thoughts for this Sunday. Our scripture reading for this week comes from Matthew's Gospel and chapter 27 and verses 15 to 26. The crowd cried out, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." In less than 40 years from then, their city and temple would be overthrown and destroyed. More than 1 million people would perish in the siege. Thousands would die by famine, thousands by disease, thousands by the sword, and their blood ran down the streets like water, so that Josephus, the Jewish historian, says it extinguished the things that were burning in the city. Thousands more were crucified, suffering the same punishment that they had inflicted on the Messiah. So great was the number of those who were crucified that Josephus says they were obliged to cease from it, room being wanted for the crosses and crosses for the men. Wherever Christ went, people followed him. The fact is that crowds were constantly drawn to him. We see that at his baptism on the banks of the River Jordan. We see that when he gave his Sermon on the Mount, when he fed 5,000 people, when he was at the house in Capernaum, and on so many other occasions. The crowds had always been accepting, open-hearted. They listened attentively and were responsive. So was this the same crowd who now stood in the shadow of the cross? Was this the same crowd that had welcomed him with such acclaim on the occasion when he had ridden into Jerusalem so triumphantly? Were these the same people who had seen him heal the sick, make the lame walk, and give sight to the blind? Were these the same people who had seen him feed the hungry multitude, who had sat listening to him hour after hour, enraptured by his teachings? Is it the same people whose hearts now suddenly turn on him and shout with one voice, "Crucify him"? I'm sure that the great majority of ordinary folk who had witnessed the work of Jesus and followed his ministry would have been horrified to wake up on that morning to discover it was the day of Jesus' crucifixion. However, as with any leader, there would always be those who would watch and wait and even work for that person's downfall. Jesus' situation was no different. On the periphery, hanging back at the edge of the crowd, were his detractors, those people who sought to undermine him, those who plotted and schemed his downfall, those who were the stooges of the priests. At his trials, those people would appear again. They were a hostile and unforgiving crowd, and they hounded him all through his ministry, from Galilee to Golgotha. In this crowd, there would have been a mixture of people, not necessarily those who heard him gladly, but maybe those who had heard him with some sort of reservation, perhaps with some measure of scepticism, people who found his challenges and claims too demanding, those who wanted to sit on the fence and keep their options open. This was a segment of the crowd that wanted the easier option, those who would rather go with the flow, maybe even hoping that one day this confident, miracle-working Galilean preacher man would get his comeuppance. This crowd, whoever it was made up of, were involved in the crucifixion of Jesus, and they were those who stood also in the shadow of the cross. The The crowd gave in to the advantage of the moment. They were sucked into a political manoeuvre. And we see Pilate desperately trying to get himself out of a situation. On the evidence before him, he'd already decided that Jesus was an innocent man, and he asks, what evil has he done? Luke, in his account, tells us that the question was put before the crowd 3 times. So anxious Pilate was to release Jesus. And there's a great testimony to Jesus that neither his judge nor his prosecutors nor his accusers could find that he'd done anything wrong. Pilate was under immense pressure to keep on the right side of the religious authorities, those who were demanding the death of Jesus. And so we see Pilate trying to pass the buck to the crowd, thinking that it would get him off the hook by laying the responsibility on the people. But of course, in the end, it was only Pilate who had the power either to condemn to death or to release a prisoner. And Pilate opted out of making the decision. He transferred it to the crowd, the priests, and therefore absolved himself of any responsibility of the guilt of Christ's blood. We see him washing his hands before them as a sign of cleansing his guilt. And he gave them the option. The crowd made the decision. But the crowd had allowed themselves to be persuaded, to be coerced, and to be convinced by the religious authority and political pressure. As well as manipulation from Pilate, the crowd were under pressure from the priests, who were influencing them in favour of Barabbas. They felt Barabbas was more deserving than Jesus. And they had worked feverishly in the early hours when most people would have been in bed and asleep. They urgently pressed the crowd to have Jesus executed. An incredible influence was exerted on the minds of these people in such a short space of time. The priests worked the crowd into an excited frenzy, and as it grew, the crowd shouted all the louder. The crowd were swayed. They were caught up by popular opinion in the moment. And as well as Pilate and the priests influencing the crowd itself also took a view. Galileans had always been held in contempt and despised, especially by those in Jerusalem. The priests had ridiculed claims of Jesus. And as far as the crowd was concerned, Jesus was now fair game. He should be punished for all that he had claimed and professed to be. It had been proved through the generations that when ordinary people come together, they become more powerful than they know. And this crowd had now made up its mind, and it was as guilty as anyone else. This crowd played a significant part, along with Judas, the Pharisees, the priests, and also Pilate, in bringing about the death of Jesus. In the shadow of the cross, in this crowd, were ordinary men and women, ordinary people who had allowed themselves in several ways to be swayed into condemning and killing Jesus. In these days, we hear a great deal about fake news. Fake news is nothing new in our generation, for Jesus himself was a subject of fake news. It's easy to be sucked into the crowd, often without realising the enormity of the consequences. There may have been times when we found ourselves caught up in a crowd, dragged along by its influence, perhaps being involved in something that we know is wrong, or joining in a conversation that we know is wrong. It's been said that evil triumphs when good men do nothing.